Welcome to Critical IT Solutions podcast series, where technology leadership meets innovation. Join us as we explore the ideas shaping modern IT, from cybersecurity to quantum computing and everything in between.
There are an estimated 350,000 suppliers in the U.S. defense industrial base, and right now, the vast majority of them are scrambling to meet a cybersecurity certification that could literally determine whether they keep their government contracts. Today, we are breaking down CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, specifically what it means for DoD and Department of Energy contractors, what Level 2 readiness actually looks like in practice, and how companies are getting there with the right partner in their corner. By the end of this episode, you will understand what the certification requires, why the recent Phase 2 suspension is not the relief some contractors think it is, and what a real compliance journey looks like from the inside. I have got someone here who has been deep in this space, so let's get into it. Walk me through what CMMC actually is and why it exists.
So CMMC, the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, was introduced by the Department of Defense back in 2020, and the core problem it was trying to solve was actually pretty embarrassing for the defense supply chain. Contractors were self-attesting that they met cybersecurity requirements, and a lot of them were just not telling the truth.
Wait, so they were just saying, yay, we're secure, and nobody was checking?
Exactly. According to Elevate Consult's guide for DoD contractors, many companies overstated their compliance under this self-reporting system while cyber incidents among defense suppliers continued to rise. And this wasn't a small problem. We're talking about sensitive defense information sitting on systems that weren't actually protected the way contractors claimed.
And I imagine the attacks that were happening in the background made this even more urgent.
Absolutely. The DoD Contractor Compliance Guide specifically calls out the SolarWinds supply chain compromise, the Hafnium Exchange vulnerabilities, and the Log4j exploits as events that intensified the focus on this issue. These weren't theoretical threats, they were real breaches that exposed how vulnerable the defense supply chain actually was.
So CMMC was the government's answer to all of that. But help me understand the structure, because I know there are different levels, and I want to make sure listeners understand what we're actually talking about when we say Level 2.
Right, so CMMC uses a 3-tier model. Level 1 is the baseline. It applies to contractors handling what's called Federal Contract Information, or FCI, and it requires 15 basic security practices with an annual self-assessment. Level 3 is the top tier, for contractors working with the most sensitive information, and those assessments are actually conducted by the DoD itself.
And Level 2 is where most contractors land.
Level 2 is the big one for most of the defense industrial base. It applies to contractors handling Controlled Unclassified Information, CUI, and it requires implementation of all 110 security controls from NIST SP 800-171 Revision 2, organized across 14 control families. And according to Elevate Consult, the DoD estimates that approximately 80,000 contractors will need Level 2 certification through a third-party assessment organization.
Okay, so 110 controls, 14 families. That sounds like a lot. What does the scoring actually look like? Do you have to be perfect?
You don't have to be perfect, but you have to be close. The scoring system goes up to 110 points, and to get what's called a conditional assessment, you need to hit at least 88 out of 110. That's 80% compliance. And then you have 180 days to mitigate any remaining findings. But here's the thing, there is no partial credit on individual controls. A C3PO assessor evaluates every single control within every family, and if a control isn't implemented, it isn't implemented.
That's a pretty unforgiving standard.
It is. And that's actually what makes the compliance journey so hard for a lot of contractors. Policy Cortex put it really well. The fixed November clock may be gone right now, but the implementation gap is not. Which brings us to something that's been creating a lot of confusion in the space lately.
The Phase 2 suspension. Yeah, I want to dig into that because I think a lot of contractors heard suspended and thought, great, we can relax.
And that would be a very costly mistake. On July 13, 2026, the Department of War announced the immediate suspension of CMMC Phase 2 requirements, which had been scheduled for November 10, 2026. The suspension was tied to a 60-day reform review aimed at aligning with directives around lowering barriers for small and non-traditional businesses. But, and this is critical, all Phase 1 self-assessment requirements remain firmly in place.
So the third-party certification piece is paused, but everything else is still running.
Exactly. Echelon Risk and Cyber said it best. CMMC Phase 2 is suspended. Your security requirements are not. DVARS 25220470012, the clause that requires covered contractor systems to safeguard covered defense information, that is still fully in effect. The 72-hour cyber incident reporting requirements are unchanged. Contractors still need to be building their system security plans, closing gaps, and strengthening their NIST 800-171 programs.
So the pause is really just a pause on the formal third-party certification clock, not on the underlying security obligations.
That's exactly right. And the contractors who treat this as a vacation are going to find themselves in a very difficult position when the task force completes its review and the program restarts. The work still needs to happen.
Let's zoom out a little bit because I think there's a piece of this story that a lot of people don't realize. This isn't just a DoD issue anymore. The Department of Energy is getting pulled into this too.
This is one of the most underappreciated parts of the CMMC story. The framework was built for the defense industrial base, but cybersecurity threats don't stop at the Pentagon's door. Energy infrastructure, research, healthcare, all of it is a target. And the DOE is now seriously looking at adopting NIST 800-171 based requirements for its contractors.
But doesn't the DOE already have its own cybersecurity framework?
It does, and that's actually part of the problem. The DOE currently uses a NIST 853-based system, which is far more comprehensive and demanding than NIST 800-171. According to CMMC expert Robert Ashcraft in a webinar on this topic, the DOE saw very quickly that 853 was too heavy for most of their contractors. So now they're seriously considering adopting the 171 framework for simplicity and consistency.
So the DOE's current standard is actually stricter, and they're looking to simplify it by moving toward the CMMC framework. That's kind of counterintuitive.
It is, right? And CMMC expert Chris Hay put it plainly, we're looking at a timeline where other agencies will adopt 171 based systems over the next couple of years. It's not a matter of if, but when. The projected window for DAE adoption is 2026 to 2027, with potential expansion to agencies like DHS and NASA beyond that.
So if you're a contractor working with the DOAE right now, you should probably be paying very close attention to what DoD contractors are going through, because that could be your near future.
That's the right way to think about it. Getting ahead of CMMC-style requirements now, even if you're primarily a DOE contractor, is genuinely strategic. The compliance infrastructure you build transfers.
Okay, so let's talk about what this actually looks like on the ground. Because I think the gap between here are the 110 controls you need and here's how you actually get there is where a lot of contractors are struggling.
The struggle is real, and the search results have some pretty sobering examples. Planet Security's blog documented a 150-person manufacturing company specializing in defense electronics that came to them after spending 8 months and $200,000 with another cybersecurity vendor. 8 months, $200,000. And they were nowhere close to CMMC Level 2 compliance.
$200,000 and still not compliant. What went wrong?
Their previous vendor had delivered a patchwork of disconnected security tools, policies that didn't match their actual operations, and technical controls that looked good on paper but failed in practice. Planet Security described it as compliance theater instead of actual security, and the company had zero confidence they'd pass a real assessment.
Compliance theater. That phrase is going to stick with me.
It's a real phenomenon. And there's another case that's even more stark. A 45-person aerospace supplier was 6 months away from losing their prime contractor status because they couldn't achieve CMMC compliance. Their IT consultant had been trying for over a year with limited success. The problems were overcomplicated architecture, security controls that interfered with business operations, and documentation that consumed weeks of staff time with no clear path forward.
6 months from losing prime contractor status. That's not a compliance problem at that point. That's an existential threat to the business.
Exactly. And that's the stakes we're talking about for a lot of these companies. Losing DoD contracts because of compliance failures isn't just expensive, it can be the end of the business. Which is why who you partner with on this journey matters enormously.
So let's talk about what a successful engagement actually looks like. Because Critical IT Solutions is in this space, and there are documented examples of companies getting this right. What does the process look like when it works?
When it works, it starts with a comprehensive gap assessment. You have to know exactly where you stand against the 110 NIST 800-171 controls before you can build a remediation roadmap. That's step one, and it's non-negotiable. You can't fix what you haven't measured.
And that gap assessment, is that something most contractors can do internally, or do they need outside help?
The honest answer is that most contractors don't have the internal expertise to do it well. Fania Carter, CEO of SSC, one of the first small businesses to achieve CMMC Level 2 certification, told OSI Beyond that the push toward certification became more urgent when an existing contract made NIST 800-171 compliance a condition for renewal. Her team had cybersecurity built into their day-to-day operations, and they still needed external guidance to navigate the formal assessment process.
So even companies that are already security conscious find the formal CMMC process challenging.
Right. And that's because CMMC isn't just about having good security, it's about being able to prove it in a way that satisfies a C3PO assessor. The documentation has to match the actual environment. The system security plan, the plan of action, and milestones, these documents have to be real, not aspirational.
Let's get specific about what the technical implementation actually involves. What are the key things that need to get done? Looking at the Secure Content Technologies case study, which documented a mid-sized defense contractor achieving Level 2 readiness, the engagement covered several critical areas: implementing encryption, access management, and audit logging on the technical side, establishing policies and procedures documentation that actually meets CMMC requirements, deploying security monitoring and incident response capabilities, preparing the system security plan and plan of action and milestones, and providing staff training specifically on handling controlled unclassified information.
That's a pretty comprehensive list. And the staff training piece, I feel like that's one that gets overlooked. It's not just about the technology. It absolutely gets overlooked. And it's one of the most common failure points. You can have perfect technical controls and still fail an assessment because your people don't know how to handle CUI properly. The Clark-Schaefer case study with an aerospace and defense manufacturer specifically called out user training as one of the key focus areas alongside data classification, access controls, and technology upgrades.
And that Clark-Schaefer case is interesting because it shows the journey isn't always a straight line to full compliance, right? They were working toward a target score, not instant certification. That's a really important nuance. The aerospace and defense manufacturer Clark-Schaefer worked with had about 250 employees and $18 million in annual revenue, with 70% of that coming from government contracts. They started with a score well below the 88 out of 110 threshold and worked through a phased approach: data classification, role-based access controls, CEM deployment, firewall enhancements, to get closer to that threshold while continuing to operate.
So 70% of their revenue was government contracts. That context makes the stakes very concrete.
Exactly. And that's the reality for a huge portion of the defense industrial base. These aren't just compliance checkboxes, they're the conditions for keeping the lights on. Which is why the Secure Content Technologies result is so striking. That mid-sized defense contractor achieved CMMC Level 2 readiness 3 months ahead of schedule, closed 100% of identified security control gaps, passed their preliminary assessment with 0 major findings, and secured contract renewals worth more than $15 million annually.
3 months ahead of schedule and 0 major findings. What made the difference in that engagement? The president of that defense technology contractor said it directly. CMMC compliance felt overwhelming until we engaged SCT. Their team's deep knowledge of defense requirements and practical approach got us compliant faster than we thought possible. They saved our most important contracts. The key phrase there is practical approach. Not theoretical compliance, not documentation that looks good on paper, actual implementation that holds up under scrutiny.
And that's the difference between compliance theater and real security.
That's exactly it. And it connects to something Bear Advisory articulated well: the ability to look at issues through the eyes of an auditor and make impactful adjustments to meet controls. That auditor mindset is what separates partners who actually get you certified from ones who leave you with a patchwork of disconnected tools.
I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the bottleneck on the assessor side. Because even if a contractor does everything right internally, there's a structural problem with the number of available C3PAOs.
This is one of the most underappreciated challenges in the entire CMMC ecosystem. According to Elevate Consult, the defense industrial base has an estimated 350,000 suppliers competing for a limited number of authorized assessors. Compliance can take 6 to 12 months to achieve. So even if you start today, you might not be able to get an assessment slot when you need one.
So it's not just about being ready, it's about being ready early enough to actually get in line.
That's the reality. And Echelon Risk and Cyber made a point that I think is really actionable here. Contractors should keep building their SSPs, closing gaps, and strengthening their NIST 800-171 programs, because that work pays off regardless of what the Reform Task Force recommends. The Phase 2 suspension doesn't change the value of being prepared.
It's almost like the suspension created a window, not to stop, but to get further ahead.
That's a really good way to frame it. The contractors who use this window to close gaps, finalize their documentation, and get their people trained are going to be in a dramatically better position when Phase 2 restarts. The ones who treat it as a hall pass are going to be scrambling.
Let's talk about the process from a consulting standpoint, because I think listeners who are in this space want to understand what a structured engagement actually looks like step by step.
The frameworks that work tend to follow a consistent pattern. Bear Advisory lays it out in 4 stages. First, architecture and business process mapping, understanding your data flows and defining the scope of what needs to be compliant. Second, gap analysis against the 800-171 baseline. Third, implementation support, actually putting the controls in place. And fourth, sustainment through ongoing virtual CISO services to maintain audit readiness.
That fourth stage, sustainment, is interesting because CMMC isn't a one-and-done certification, right?
Not at all. Under the CMMC 2 framework, contractors need to undergo C3PAO assessment every 3 years for Level 2 contracts, and they have to affirm continuous compliance annually. So the work doesn't end when you get certified, you have to maintain that posture. That's why the sustainment piece is so critical, and why partners who offer ongoing support are more valuable than ones who just help you pass the initial assessment.
Annual affirmation of continuous compliance. That's a real ongoing commitment.
It is. And it's actually one of the things that makes CMMC fundamentally different from the old self-attestation model. You can't just say you're compliant once and forget about it. The framework is designed to create a culture of continuous security, not a one-time checkbox.
Which, when you think about the threat landscape, nation-state actors, supply chain attacks, that continuous posture makes a lot of sense.
It does. And the CMMC program is explicitly designed around that reality. The tiered model means that the more sensitive the information you handle, the more rigorous the requirements. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach, it scales with the actual risk.
Let me ask you something that I think a lot of smaller contractors are probably wondering. Is this achievable for a small business? Because the 45-person aerospace supplier story was pretty alarming. It is achievable, and SSC's story is proof of that. Fania Carter's company became one of the first small businesses to achieve CMMC Level 2 certification. But the key word is achievable, not easy. It requires commitment, the right partner, and starting early enough to have time to close gaps before an assessment. And the right partner is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that equation.
Enormously. The difference between the 150-person manufacturer that spent $200 K and got nowhere versus the one that achieved readiness 3 months ahead of schedule comes down almost entirely to the quality of the partner and the approach. Integrated security architecture versus bolt-on tools. Real documentation versus aspirational policies. That's the gap.
So, when you step back from everything we've covered today, here's what I'm taking away. CMMC is not a bureaucratic nuisance. It's a response to real, documented failures in how the defense supply chain was protecting sensitive information.
That's exactly right. And the Phase 2 suspension doesn't change that underlying reality. The contractual obligations under DARS 25220470012 are still in force. The 110 controls still need to be implemented. The documentation still needs to be real. The only thing that changed is the formal third-party certification timeline, and even that is temporary.
And for DOE contractors who might be listening and thinking this doesn't apply to them yet, the experts are pretty clear that it's coming. The 2026 to 2027 window for DOA adoption of NIST 800-171-based frameworks is not far away.
The writing is on the wall. Chris Hayes said it plainly, it's not a matter of if, but when. And the contractors who get ahead of it now, who build the compliance infrastructure before it becomes mandatory, are going to have a significant competitive advantage. They'll be able to bid on contracts that their less prepared competitors can't touch.
That's actually a really interesting reframe, CMMC readiness as a competitive advantage, not just a compliance burden.
It's the right way to think about it. The defense industrial base has 350,000 suppliers. The ones who are certified and audit ready are going to stand out in a crowded field. And when you look at the Secure Content Technologies result, $15 million plus in secured contract renewals, the return on investment for getting this right is very real.
Here's what this really comes down to. The contractors who are winning right now are the ones who stopped treating CMMC as a deadline problem and started treating it as a security posture problem. The deadline can move, and it did. The threat landscape doesn't.
That's the most important thing anyone in this space can internalize. The Phase 2 suspension gave contractors more time, but it didn't give them a reason to stop. If anything, it's an opportunity to do the work properly instead of rushing to meet a deadline and ending up with compliance theater.
And the companies that partner with firms like Critical IT Solutions, ones that bring that auditor mindset, that practical approach, that integrated architecture, those are the ones coming out the other side with zero major findings and their contracts intact.
Exactly. The president of that defense technology contractor said it best. Their partner saved their most important contracts. That's not a compliance story. That's a business survival story.
We started this episode talking about 350,000 suppliers and a shrinking pool of authorized assessors. Here's the question every contractor in that pool needs to be asking right now. When the clock restarts, and it will restart, will you be ready or will you be scrambling? The window is open. The work is the same either way. The only variable is whether you use the time.
And the cost of not using it is measured in contracts, not just compliance scores.
Thanks for being here and breaking all of this down.
Thank you for listening to Critical IT Solutions podcast. If you are a DoD or DOE contractor trying to figure out where you stand, the first step is a gap assessment. Know your numbers before someone else tells you what it is. If you find this podcast informative, please like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss future podcasts like this. Feel free to add your comments below.